Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Before we get started, I want to give my sincerest condolences to the victim family and friends, and I want to state that all the information found in this video has been found on the internet and or social media. So before we get started, the witnesses in this trial had the option to be filmed and audio recorded, and a lot of the witnesses chose to opt out. So a lot of this stuff I found on the internet, so I will be saying allegedly because I wasn't there. So the information that I gathered from the witnesses who chose not to be filmed or audio recorded is from news medias who were able to be in the courtroom and they were able to take notes. So day one opens up with Bobby Jo Manley, who's a sister of Dana Roden, who was one of the people who found the bodies. She was the first person to opt out of being filmed or audio recorded, so all of this information is alleged. So from what's being reported, she testified to finding Christopher Sr. and Gary Roden. She talks about seeing the blood smeared from the living room through the house to the bodies where she found them. She talks about calling 911. She testifies to going to Frankie and Hannah Hazel's house and seeing Baby Ruger in the middle of them, and she testified to Baby Ruger nursing on Hannah Hazel's deceased body. She also testified to going to the sheriff's office, giving a statement, giving her DNA, providing a gunshot residue swab of her hands, and that her clothes and her shoes were seized at that time. So John Parker, the other attorney for George Wagner IV, is giving the cross-examinations, and he asked her about the cockfighting ring and the drug dealing. And although Bobby Jo testified to working for Christopher Sr. for a few years, she does also testify that she does not know anything about his marijuana operation and that she does not know anything about any trips of him taking to Mexico. She does say that sometimes he does leave for several days at a time, and that he has cameras at his house. She does confirm that. Witness number 2 is Billy Morgan, another person who was there with Bobby Jo, and he also found the bodies. So he testifies that he's not exactly sure of his age, that he knows he was born in the 70s, that he can't read or write. They speak about his mannerisms and how he speaks very, very softly, allegedly, and that he kept his head down the entire time, allegedly. So he testifies to only knowing Christopher Sr. for about a month. And the reason he knows him is because Christopher Sr. gave him a truck and he did odd and end chores for Christopher Sr. in order to pay the truck off. He testified not knowing anything about Christopher Sr.'s alleged drug operation, that he did smell weed by the barn from time to time, but he did not know what marijuana looked like, so he wouldn't be able to say if it was marijuana. His shoes were also seized. And then on cross-examination from the defense, he testified to seeing Christopher Sr. and Billy Wagner going to a truck to talk a few times. So the third witness was James Manley, which is Dana Roden's brother, and he opted to be on camera, so none of this is alleged because I did watch this myself. So James starts his testimony about the relationship between him and Dana, which he said was good. He also speaks about Dana's relationship with Christopher Sr. and said that even though they were divorced, the relationship was still the same as if they were married. He goes on to speak about helping Dana move into her new house and how he helped her move some beds in, and then he helped clean up the yard for her as well. And that Frankie had a job remodeling houses with his son Cody. He also testified to his relationship with Dana's children being a good relationship, that Frankie himself, his son Cody, and Christopher Jr. used to all ride derby cars as well as fix them up. He testified to Frankie having fighting chickens and that you could tell that they were fighting chickens because they would be tied to a crate or a barrel to keep them separated. He also testified that on April 22nd of 2016, he didn't go to work because it was raining outside and he had called his employer and his employer told him not to go in. So he went outside to work on his four-wheeler. While working on his four-wheeler, he saw Billy Morgan pull up and go speak to his parents. He said he didn't hear the conversation, but the way that his father walked out of the house, he could tell that it was important. So he got in his truck and followed Billy Morgan, his mother and father, to the location, which was Frankie's house. He testified to seeing one of the children covered in blood, and at that point he asked his sister Bobby Jo what happened. He said at that point he was told that Frankie and Hannah Hazel were deceased, as well as Christopher Sr. and Gary Roden. He was then asked about his son Cody and how his son Cody got to the crime scene, and he testified that Cody arrived to Frankie's house because on the day of April 22nd, Cody and Frankie were supposed to go to work together. He testifies leaving Frankie's house and going to Dana's house, and the reason that he went to Dana's house is because his phone was out of minutes. He does testify that once he gets to Dana's house, he tries knocking on the door and the door opens up. He says he calls her name over and over, and he was aware that she works crazy hours, so he thought that she just was in a deeper sleep. So that he walks into Dana's room and that it was dark inside, so he began to feel on the bed to see if she was there. Once he realized that she was there, he kept trying to wake her up, and he reached up to her head where he felt the pillow. He tries to lift the pillow. He realizes that it's sticking to her face, and at that point, he knows that she's also deceased. He says he releases the pillow, and he leaves the house. He does testify to hearing Hannah Mae's 5-day-old baby Kylie crying, but again, he says he couldn't bring himself to go see anything further. Once he leaves the house, he goes to get his wife April Manley. He tells her that Christopher Sr., Gary, Frankie, Hannah Hazel, and Dana are deceased. He then tells her that they have to go back to get Hannah Mae's 5-day-old baby Kylie, and that's what they do. They get in a car, they drive to Dana's house, and they try to park by the mailbox because he decides that he knows that the cops are coming, and he wants to be out of their way, and he wants to be able to go back to where his parents are to console them. He says when he gets to the doors to get baby Kylie, something tells him not to go back inside. So he says he waits, and once he sees the first cop, he flags them down and lets them know that at least one person in Dana's house is deceased and that there's a baby inside. He states that the cops didn't tell him exactly what they found in the household, that they did bring the baby out, and his wife, April, went with the baby to the hospital. He said he was put in a police cruiser and that the police took him to Frankie's house where he could see his family grieving, but he wasn't allowed to be with his family. He talks about going to the station and giving a statement, and that he didn't give his boots up because they were $200 new boots, but he did allow them to take pictures of his boots. And that after being at the sheriff's station, he called his mother and father to pick him up, where they took him to the church where everyone else was at, and that's where he also found out Kenneth Roden was deceased. Throughout his testimony on both the prosecuting and defense team, he was asked to speak up several times, and he does talk low, but he also talks with a southern accent where the words kind of run together. So on cross-examination, they began by asking how old Dana was when she got married to Christopher Sr., and he said 16 or 17, and that he wasn't aware of how old Chris was, but that he knew that he was older. The defense then asked him about Chris being generous, which he testifies to, that Chris did help the family out as far as giving them money if they needed it. James testified to Chris Sr. working for himself as well as working at Big Bear Lake, that he wasn't aware of Christopher Sr.'s marijuana operation. He did say that he went to Christopher's house sometimes, but on April 22nd, the day of the crimes, he did not make it to Chris's house. He stopped at Frankie's. He testified to himself, his father, Bobby Joe, and Cody seeing Frankie and Hannah Hazel's body from the hallway of the bedroom. He also expressed that nobody from his family touched or removed anything from the house to his knowledge. The defense then asked about Dana's house, and he testified again to being in the house less than a minute. He testified to Hannah Mae having a newborn baby and that he hadn't had a chance to meet the baby yet. He said he knew of Jake Wagner as well as Billy Wagner. He knew Jake from seeing him at holiday parties with the family, and he knew of Billy Wagner from seeing him talk to Christopher Sr. from time to time. He testifies to not being aware of Christopher Sr. building a new barn. He was then asked about Christopher Sr. helping Dana by buying the house for her. He said that he was aware that he paid half of the house in cash and that the other half he got with a loan. He spoke about the pigs and chickens and dogs that Christopher Sr. and Frankie owned. He also talked about Christopher Sr. traveling with a guy named Robin, who was the guy that Christopher Sr. worked for at Big Bear Lake, and that he knew of them going on a couple of trips together. He then talked about Christopher Sr. having a really big fireworks display between his house and Frankie's house, and that he did it every year. So in my opinion, the defense is trying to show that Christopher had access to a bunch of money and that he spent it very freely. And with the type of job that he had, he couldn't have this much money. Witness number 4 was Deputy Jonathan Chandler, and he opted to not be recorded or audioed as well. So again, all of this is alleged. But allegedly, he testified that he was a deputy for about a year in 2016, and that he was initially dispatched to 4077 Union Hill Road. But before he could make it, he was flagged down at Frankie's house, and he was told about the bodies that were in Frankie's house as well as the baby. He testified to the baby being covered head to toe in blood, and that the family that had arrived was frantic, that they were very upset, and that they were very emotional. He testifies to knowing that Frankie and Hannah Hazel were deceased based off the pools of blood on the bed and the bruising and the gunshot wounds to Frankie's head. He testified that the last thing that he did before he went home for that day was help BCI remove Dana, Christopher Jr., and Hannah Mae from the home. The last witness for the day was Justin Waring, and he was the paramedic, and he opted to be on camera. Justin testified to being a paramedic since 2012 and that he worked at Portsmouth Ambulance at the time of the crime. He testified working 24-hour shifts, and at the time, he was being awakened by one of his co-workers to be told that they needed to report to a crime scene. He testified to at the time they were thinking that they were going to an assault that had a lot of blood at the scene. He testified to 3 trucks being dispatched to the scene and that it could take 20 minutes to an hour to arrive to that particular location, depending on how fast you drive. He also testifies that once he gets to the crime scene, the people that are there ask them if there's more trucks coming. They begin to ask why, and the people explain that there's victims at Christopher Sr.'s house, there's victims at Frankie's house, and then there's victims down the road at Dana's house. So the EMT teams decide to split up. Him and his partner Chuck, they stay at Frankie and Hannah Hazel's house. And then the other people, Jeff and Miranda, they go to Christopher Sr.'s house. He does testify that it is protocol for the police to clear any scenes for EMT to go in to make sure that it's safe. But he explains that it's not just with crime scenes, that it could be with domestic violence, it could be with a mental health patient, it could be with an overdose. So anytime that they get on a scene, the police are there to assist them as well as make sure the scene is safe. He stated that he wanted to verify that the victims were deceased, so he decided to go into the house himself to verify. He also says that at that time he has his partner go to the car to get a heart monitoring machine. And then he says once he gets to the room that he can see that by the pool of blood that's on the bed as well as the lack of movement that they are indeed deceased, so they don't even use the heart machine. He testifies to seeing Brentley and Ruger, Brentley being the 3-year-old that Frankie had with Celeste and Ruger being the 6-month-old baby that Frankie had with Hannah Hazel. He testifies that he knows for sure that Ruger went to the hospital because his coworker Miranda took him to the hospital, but he wasn't aware if Brentley went to the hospital at all. He also testifies that Sheriff Reeder is the one who gave the order for them to stage in between Christopher Sr.'s house and Dana's house. He also testifies to them leaving well after dark, and then he's also shown pictures of baby Ruger. He does testify that the baby looked the same as far as the blood that was there. The only thing that was different indicated in that picture was the baby's pamper had been changed. He was also shown pictures of Frankie and Hannah Gilly, and he did verify that those were the bodies that he's seen that day. On cross-examination, he was asked about leaving the station and what time he left the location. He said he wasn't exactly sure of the times and that it would be on his run report, which is a report that each EMT has to do when they are dispatched to any location. They also asked him about rigor mortis, where he simply just told them that by looking at the bodies, he wasn't able to tell if they were in rigor mortis, and because he didn't touch the bodies, he would have no idea whether or not that was true. Judge Daring opened up day 3 by saying that there was a photo of one of the babies covered in blood and it was published in the newspaper. He wanted to go on record to say that he does not want any pictures of the deceased, any pictures of bloody crime scenes, or pictures of minors to be published in the newspaper. And he wants the defense team as well as the prosecution to let the court know when these photos are going to be coming up. So the first witness of the day is Deputy Adam Ball. He is now a lieutenant, and he chose not to be filmed or audio recorded. So allegedly, he testified to declaring some of the victims deceased. He testified to checking Dana's vitals. From what I gather, they were showing pictures of Christopher Jr., and the jury began to tear up, allegedly. The defense cross-examination, they only asked him about the locations of the crimes. Witness 2 was Officer Morgan Music. He also chose not to be filmed or audio recorded, but allegedly he testified to being dispatched to what he thought was an assault, that he did help with the crime scenes once he got there, and that he did 12-hour shifts for 2 months to guard the trailer homes until they were moved to a secure lot. Witness number 3 is Sheriff Tracy D. Evans. He also chose not to be filmed or audio recorded. He testified allegedly that during the crime scenes, he worked for Sheriff Reeder as a major, and that he oversaw felony investigations. He also allegedly testifies that he heard a code 8 over the radio, and a code 8 stands for an assault. He also then testifies that the deputies might have needed help with the crime scene, so he decided to go to the crime scene. He testifies to lifting the pillow off of Dana's head and seeing Christopher Jr. as well. He was also in charge of getting the search warrants until the BCI agents arrived and took over the case. He also worked with prosecutor Rob Junk to secure all of the warrants. He testified that at that point his family had an emergency some point throughout the day, and once he left the crime scene, he never went back to help. He was also asked allegedly by a reporter as to why he didn't want to be filmed or audioed, and he said he had no comment and walked off. The fourth witness was Timothy Dickerson, who is now the director of Pike County Emergency Management. At the time, he was a major. He chose to be audioed, filmed, and recorded, so this is not alleged. I did get to watch his testimony. He testified in 2016 his responsibilities were overseeing road deputies, that he made sure that they turned in their paperwork, that if somebody called off that the shift was covered, and that he would review records and files from crimes that happened the night before. He said that on the morning of the 16th he was in his house and he heard a code 16 over the radio. A code 16 in police talk is a deceased person. He said it wasn't uncommon, but he said when he heard the second code 16, that's when he decided he would go to the crime scene. He testified that it took him about 30 minutes to get there, and then once he arrived, the now Sheriff Tracy Evans directed him to a different crime scene than the original one he heard on the radio. The crime scene that he's referring to is Dana's house. He testifies to going in and seeing Christopher Jr. He testifies to going in to see Hannah, and then he also testifies to going in to see Dana. He also testifies that there was a tiny baby that was in the household and that the baby was laid up against Hannah Mae's chest and stomach area. He testified that her breasts were exposed and that the baby could have possibly been nursing on her deceased body. He testifies to calling for an EMT to remove the baby, and they went back out and took the baby to the ambulance. He also testifies that once he gets to Dana's room, that the pillow had been removed, but he himself did not remove it. He did testify to seeing James Manley at the crime scene, but that he didn't speak to him, and that he did find out later that he needed to be questioned and that someone else would have taken him to the sheriff's office. He testified to the BCI being called in and that it was the sheriff's decision, and that later on he worked with BCI during the investigation because he knew the area. So the prosecution asked him what type of footwear that he had on. And I forgot to mention, every single witness up until this point has been asked about their shoes. And it's so that the defense team can't say that someone else left those shoe prints that were found at the crime scenes. He was then shown pictures of Dana's house, as well as all of the victims, which is Dana, Hannah Mae, and Christopher Jr. He did testify that the injuries are consistent with gunshot wounds, and he also was shown a blown up picture of Hannah Mae just to show that there was a pacifier laying directly next to her. So on cross-examination from the defense, their main questioning was where Dana's house lied. If it in fact lied in Pike County or if it in fact lied in Scioto County. Now, he said based off of his experience and the conversations that they had that they did determine that it was in Pike County, and that was basically all of the defense's questioning. So before the last witnesses of the day, the defense decided to put on record that they have an ongoing objection to the pictures of the victims being shown on the screen, especially if they were already shown to the previous witness. He said something along the lines of maybe they could put it in a booklet form where the jury could look at it if they chose to, and the judge overruled it. Witness 5 of the day was Gary Michael Mosley. He begins his testimony by talking about his police training. He began his training in 2008 and then he officially became a policeman in 2009. He said that he initially responded to a call that was supposed to be a gunshot call. He says his car was following Deputy Dickerson's car as well as Deputy Music's car. He testifies to seeing people running and flagging him down, so he chose to stop at the location where he seen the people. The house he stopped at was also Dana's house. He testified to getting updates on what was going on in the situation. So he was hearing updates from Chris Sr.'s house as well as Frankie's house. So he had a good idea of what was going on. He elaborates in great detail on how they cleared the house to make sure that it was safe and that there were no active shooters there. After that, they asked him what type of boots he had on. He testifies at some point getting to Frankie's house and seeing one of the kids running around and that he tried to wipe the baby up a little bit. On cross-examination by the defense, they asked him all about sweeping a house all over again, and he just testified to what he already said. The last witness of the day is EMS worker Miranda Cable. She is deciding to be audioed and filmed, and she testifies to being the paramedic, one of the paramedics that shows up at the crime scene. She's currently a nurse present day, so they went over her schooling and how she got to become a nurse. Then they go back to April 22nd of 26. She testifies to thinking that she's going out for a domestic call run and that it may be someone deceased on the scene. She does confirm Jeff's testimony from earlier that there was 3 trucks that came out, but 2 of them came out. Her truck and Jeff's truck came out first, and then later on they sent the 3rd truck. She testifies to being in the truck with Jeff and that Jeff was driving because he was a basic EMT and that she was a paramedic. So because she was a higher level, they would want her to be back there with the patients. She testified to pulling up to Frankie's house and that Justin did stay at Frankie's house and that she moved on to Christopher Sr.'s house. She said at that time she was told by the police that were there that there was a 3rd crime scene and that there may be someone who needed assistance. So her and Jeff, who is her now husband, the 3rd crime scene being Dana's house. When they got there, Pike County already had their own ambulance team there, so she asked if they needed assistance, and he said everything was covered. They went to stage and waited until they were needed. She was shown pictures of the houses just to show where she parked and how she got in, and the defense didn't do any cross-examination. So really quick, my thoughts is the prosecution is doing a really good job of showing how chaotic this crime scene was. They've been able to show different departments of law enforcement coming in. They've been able to show different departments of paramedics coming in. They've been able to show how they weren't even able to get to the original crime scene. And that's what the jury needs to hear. My opinion so far, the defense is not disputing much because we can't say it didn't happen. Everybody knows that 8 people passed away on April 22nd. I'm still curious to see what they plan on shaking out when it is their turn. I also got a feeling they're just waiting on Jake Wagner to do his testimony, and that's where they're going to try their hardest to prove that George Wagner IV had nothing to do with the crime. Tell me what you think in the comments below. If you made it to the end of the video, I appreciate you so much, and I'm out.